Okay, so the first panel will discuss the current state of EDI in the Marcomms, and I'm delighted to be joined by two very special panelists, both representing and a high, sort of flying the flag high for the public sector. But we have got Edna Boampong, Director of Communications Engagement from the Liverpool City Council, and Salama, the Senior Insights Manager at Metropolitan Police. So we will start the session now. If I can ask my lovely speakers to come and join me. It is a low sofa, but we'll make it sure everybody can see us. So how it's going to work is we've divided the session into a few parts. The first one's going to look at the sort of the opening being why the conversation matters, where do the brands are currently slipping, and what is the current state. We're then going to look at the inclusion and how that is shifting in the UK. We've probably seen some big numbers statements that EDI is being cut off, forgotten, not as important, so we will talk about that. We'll also then talk about the multicultural marketing and why inclusive comms are still overlooked despite the data. And we'll look at what's shaping the campaigns and where the teams are set up to success, because appreciate it takes more than just an individual to deliver it. And then we'll also look at how to get the internal buy-ins. That's a very often a question we get asked at GottaBe Ethnic is, how do I get the internal buy-in? How do I get other people to work with us? So, with that being said, the UK is more diverse than ever. Like I've mentioned, we've got 14.6 million ethnic minorities living and work in the UK, which means the inclusive and cultural relevance in the marketing is super important, and there is also a growth for it. But political attitudes are shifting, ED&I budgets are being shrinked, and commitments to inclusion is under a lot of pressure. That's mainly coming from sort of America, but slightly coming into the UK, and we're starting to see that happening here. At GottaBe, we work with brands meaningfully wanting to connect with the ethnic minorities, but too often inclusion gets sidelined and campaigns become one-off calendar moments and not something that gets going, and we lose that momentum. So I will start off by asking some opening questions to my panel. So once again, I've got Edna from the Liverpool City Council, Director of Communications and Engagement, and Salama from the Senior Insights Manager at Metropolitan Police. So let's start with the UK being more diverse than ever before. So why does it feel like inclusion is still at risk? So Edna, Liverpool has one of the UK's oldest Black and Chinese communities. What shifts in these long-established but overlooked communities have you seen when it comes to representation?
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. And it is good to see a diverse kind of audience out there. So thank you for inviting me. You might tell from my accent that I'm actually from London, but I live up north. And
we all move around.
Yeah, move around. So the key thing for me, and particularly for people who remember COVID some time ago, what we saw during COVID was that there were certain populations that were responding to the disease differently, and in particular when we started to roll out the COVID vaccination, we knew that there was some vaccine hesitancy in certain communities. And I, at the time, was working in the NHS. My background is in health comms, and I was the Director of Communication across Cheshire and Merseyside, leading the communication response around COVID time. And because I was the only Black Director of Communications working in that area, it was me that was going, do you know what? I know we're talking about this vaccination coming, but I think we're going to have to do something differently with our ethnic minority communities, because actually I don't think that there's the same excitement about this vaccination. So we started doing some research to actually understand a little bit more about how COVID was impacting people from ethnic minority communities, and how likely they would be to take the vaccination. And we did that work and it put us in a good position when the vaccination came, and we were able to do good comms and marketing to respond to people's concerns, and ensuring it was insight-led and very targeted. So I would say, from my experience, people from ethnic minority backgrounds want to feel like people understand them. When you are communicating or marketing to them, they want to feel like their cultural nuances are understood. So, for instance, when we talk about ethnic minority or people that are ethnically diverse, if we talk about the African community, I'm Ghanaian. My background is very different from a Nigerian. So you can't just lump all ethnic minorities into one homogenous group. So we need to understand those differences. The same if you talk about Asian people, the same if you talk about people that are Eastern European. All of them are very different. So understanding those nuances is really key to be able to communicate and market clearly to them. And as you said, it's about 20% of the population identify as being an ethnic minority. That's a huge part of England, and in some areas that's even more. So in London it's even more diverse. I think it's around 40%. So understanding communities is really important, and I will shut up in a moment. And one of the things that is also very important to enable you to be able to communicate, market, engage with communities is having more diverse communication and marketing teams. It's a big thing that I've worked on for a long time, looking at, and we'll talk about this later, looking at the lack of diversity in the Marcomms sector and how that has an impact on how well we're able to communicate and engage with those different communities.
Thank you. Sam, I'll come to you next. Edna mentioned 40% of London being diverse. You're representing the Met Police, obviously looking after the people of London and in surrounding areas. So how can teams balance data-led insights with lived experience when it comes to shaping up experiences? Sort of Edna alluded to a little bit of it, but I'm intrigued as to how Met Police is doing it.
Yeah, so I think it's actually now about 50% of London that is...
Wow.
Yeah, so that's according to the latest census, if you want to get geeky with it. But London, I think, is probably one of the most diverse cities in the UK. I always think of a borough like Hackney, which isn't too far from here, where you've got a very strong white community, you've got an Afro-Caribbean community, but you've also got places like Stamford Hill, which are majority Jewish, and that's just one borough. There's tons of variations within boroughs, between boroughs. It's a very diverse place. So from our perspective at the Met, or my perspective working in insights, I think the key is having a really strong insight foundation, because I think you can't understand how people think if you don't speak to them and don't understand their points of view. And for me, that really comes down to being comprehensive in what you look at. So it's a mix of, at least at the Met, it's a mix of looking at behavioural data, so how different audiences respond to social media posts that we put out. It's looking at brand tracking studies where we can speak to a few thousand people, representative based on the London population, looking at their thoughts and attitudes to the police. But it's also smaller scale studies like focus groups, interviews, where you can really dig into the why behind some of the what that we're seeing. And I think that part is key, because that's where you can really dig into the different audiences and how they respond to things. I mean, just as one example, which I always think of recently, we do often see some differences, some discrepancies between certain data sources. So, for example, when we look at social media posts and we look at what does well on Instagram, if you use those platforms like Instagram or LinkedIn to post stuff, they give you very good metrics like impressions and likes and all of that stuff. But what we see is actually quite a big discrepancy between what performs well there and what we see in our own focus groups and what people respond to. And that's when you start to think about, okay, maybe some audiences are actually really finding something tonally not landing so well. It might be performing well for most people on Instagram, but there's a small proportion of people who just really don't like it because it hasn't struck a tone, or it might be that a certain crime that is being shown in a post actually is seen as quite negative, and people don't like that. So it's by combining those different sources, looking at the behavioural data, the tracking data, but also the focus groups, that you start to unpick different attitudes and different behaviours. So I think the recommendation would just be try and look at as many sources as possible to get that bigger picture.
And just following up on the insights, you've mentioned you're obviously doing a lot of research yourself, but are you also looking at the wider picture data, so more of a generic not necessarily saying census data, but any other sources that you would sort of compare the data against and benchmark it?
100%, and I definitely don't think the census is generic. I think, speaking as a research geek, I think it's one of the most amazing sources that we have, because it's about 22 million people in the UK that are interviewed, and it gives you an amazing, I'm sure you've used it in your studies, an amazing look at people's job, their ethnicity, their religion, all of these factors. And I think for us at the Met in London, as a starting point, it's fundamental, because if you want to appeal to an audience in a certain borough or a different ethnicity, you need to know as much as you can about that audience, and the census is the best way of doing that. So I definitely encourage, even if you're not working in London, wherever it is, the census will have some useful information for you.
I've mentioned earlier about the DKMS antis. We actually used a lot of the census data and overlaid it with some other insights in order to locate the best spots and the routes that the individuals might take when it comes to commuting, and that's underpinned of where the locations of the out-of-home media, but also the routes for the buses that we're going to be using. So we're now going to move on to the other element in terms of the multicultural marketing, and is it still optional, or is this something that should actually be underpinned in every company? So why is it that you think that marketing, especially multicultural marketing, is being sort of treated as a side project? You've mentioned earlier about having that importance of representations and also getting the insights and people. Why is it that we're only really focusing for a certain period of time, like Black History Month, Ramadan, but that's only 1 month at a time? Why is it that we can't have a multicultural strategy, and how are we going to engage with people all year round as opposed to just 1 month at a time? So question here is, how do we ensure that inclusive insight is embedded into day-to-day communications at the very start of the campaign, but also runs for the whole year as opposed to just 1 month at a time?
Well, Tomasz, so you invited me here because I am outspoken, so I'm going to keep it really real with everyone. So
Sure.
Why is it aside for a lot of the time is because we don't have representation in some of those really senior leadership roles who are decision makers. So that's partly what it is, because unless you've got more representation at those very senior levels, in those boardrooms that are having these discussions, that things like that just get forgotten about or lost or misunderstood. So it is really important to have representation, more senior people that are thinking through those things. And I'll tell you, for instance, I went to an event on Monday with big leadership from the City Council, the leader of the council, the chief exec, some of our corporate directors, and it was a groundbreaking event. So it was a big event around a massive development that we were leading in Liverpool. We got loads of media attention. We had TV there, etc. It wasn't our event, but we were invited, and there were about 30 or 40 people invited. And I looked around and I was like, "There's no one of colour apart from me in this here." And we're about to take all these pictures and put it out on our social media screen as this on our social media channels as this is a representation of Liverpool and what we're doing for Liverpool. And I was like, this doesn't feel right to me. And especially in the situation that we are in at the moment in England, where I would say I'm born and bred in England, in London, and I've never known the country to feel so racist because of the various things that are going on with various leaders in this country and outside of it. We need to be a lot more decisive and a lot more thoughtful in terms of our marketing, our communications, to ensure that we are representing the diversity of the country, and we are ensuring that people from all nationalities feel welcomed, feel included, feel like they are being represented, and it isn't just tokenistic. Because,
Absolutely.
I call out the NHS, used to call out the NHS central team all the time with doing a campaign, which is a mainstream campaign, but then because you put a few people of colour in it, you think that you are then making a diverse campaign, where actually you're not considering the different nuances and the different ways that you need to engage or communicate or market to the different people of colour. So
Absolutely.
For me, that's what it's about. It's about people that are making decisions, being thoughtful, and actually really thinking through who we're trying to target and what's the best way to do that and be authentic about it.
Thank you. Sam, coming to you next. So how can brands avoid missing the mark due to a gap between the data and the real life experience, the living experience that we've got, the reality that's out there.
Yeah, so I think there's a few tactical bits. I mean, that when it comes to research, there's always a question of probing the data and making sure that if you see maybe some slight frustration with the campaign, that you're picking up on it and trying to probe to understand why it is. But I'd completely agree. I think the more fundamental point for me is how we define comms, because I think comms for me is not just an external campaign that a specific team in an organisation pushes out once a week or whatever it is. I think especially somewhere like the Met, it is very much how an organisation speaks internally and how it speaks to its audience. I think when you think that for the Met, the product is essentially people. It's not like a consumer brand where the product is a physical product. The product is people and officers' interactions with the public, whether that's during the victim process or out and about on the street or at a ward panel. So it really comes down to comms as a fundamental strategic initiative. And you guys might have seen the pretty shocking Panorama documentary that went out recently. I think that just really showed that comms, at least for the Met, is very much how officers speak to each other internally, and then how that goes out to the public. So I think it needs to come from within. It needs to be a set of practices internally. It needs to be a set of policies when it comes to things like stop and search, which has had its critics over the years. How do you do that with the public in a way that feels fair and take into account different diversities and ethnicities? So it can't just be a campaign you put out on social media, because that's just going to fall flat if the fundamentals within aren't already fixed.
So I will stick with you for the next question. So what kind of feedback or audience helps you when it comes to identifying, whether the campaign resonated with the audience or whether it completely missed the mark? So what sort of things are you looking out for? So these guys out there, what should they be looking at?
So I think for a campaign, I mean, there's a few different bits I'd be looking at. I think as much as I'm always reluctant to look at social media comments, because they are usually a very vocal minority, sometimes it is indicative of what people think. So if you put a campaign out there, it's helpful just to pick up on that. I think looking at tone, so in our comms tracking we often track how the tone of the campaign is resonating. I think that's what's helpful. But I think for me the key thing is when it comes to at least our comms is looking at effectiveness. And for us that is the extent to which a campaign is shifting perceptions of trust and confidence in the Met, and I think that really should be the focus, because without that the point of comms is really non-existent. And it's interesting, as much as we are talking about D&I, I think from our own research, what's quite interesting to see is that often these campaigns will cut through across different ages, different ethnicities, different religions, and that's a good thing. So we often see that the campaigns that do well, let's say on Instagram, will do well whether you're 18 or 60, or whether you're white or you're black, because as much as diversity and your ethnicity is, let's say, part of who you are, as an example, in London you also have similar concerns about crime, and a lot of people, you might not be surprised, find that knife crime is the number one thing they want sorted out by the police. So that content does pretty well because that's a key concern for people. Phone theft, shoplifting, all of these things do very well regardless of your background or anything like that. So I think when it comes to tracking success and whether a campaign is resonating, yes, look at tone and look at how it's being perceived. But I think that effectiveness point is the key point, because if you're changing people's perceptions for the better, that's a good thing regardless of who they are.
And very quickly, how often do you run your research, sort of your focus groups and everything with the diverse groups? Is it relatively frequent, or is it more of as of when you've got a specific campaign, or is this a sort of an ongoing thing that you do on a monthly, quarterly basis?
So it depends on the source. I mean, the comms tracking is ongoing, and we do that every quarter, and the brand tracking is every month. Focus groups are a bit ad hoc, depending on a specific campaign that we've got or a specific issue that we want to get at. But I think generally, my belief is always more often you can speak to people, the better the results will be.
Yeah, definitely. You've mentioned earlier, Edna, around having the sort of the lived experience, but also looking at nuances and insights. So what has helped you to create a sort of a culture within your team that, you feel that would be okay to challenge you, but also sort of challenge some of the briefs and assumptions that we're seeing out there?
So I would say that I'm an insight-led communicator and marketeer, so I don't like to make assumptions about people or messages or channels. I like to actually use data to inform that. So whether that is talking to people, so I always say that people often say that we've got no time to do market research, or we've got no money to do market research, or we've actually not got the skills in-house to do it. But you don't have to spend that long or that much, or use that much money to do something quick and dirty just to get a few ideas from people, like a quick survey out there, go and have a few conversations, go to a community group, etc., to get an understanding of what people are thinking, what people are feeling, how something might land with them. So I think because I've always I've always had that, said that to people in my team, that it's all about speaking, listening, respecting people. I also have that culture within my team. So my team, and I'm quite blessed to have a really talented group of people that I work with. But there's no hierarchy in the team, and we talk about respecting people's opinions. And in Liverpool in particular, we've got a community that we have lots of deprivation. And one of the things I always teach the team is it's not about finger pointing, blaming or judgment, because people's lives, you don't know until you've walked a day in someone's shoes, you won't know what that person's going through. So I think if you have that culture within your team, that it's about really understanding people and responding to people in a way that makes sense to them and meeting people where they are, I think that sort of ensures that your team kind of go into things with an inquiring mind and being non-judgmental.
Can you tell us a little more about the diversity charter? Because I know you're very proud of the research that you've done. So I know we're short on time.
Yeah,
but
I'll be really quick.
Make sure we touch on that.
So I led a piece of work nationally, which was all about how do we increase diversity in the marketing, communicators and PR sector, because we've talked about this already, the importance of being or communicating, engaging with diverse groups, but the way to do that is ensuring that you have people within your team that represent the communities you're trying to engage with. So we did a big piece of research which gave us some really good insight into, across 3 areas, access, experience and outcomes, and we spoke to, I think, over about 1,000 people across the UK from different sectors, but people from black and minority ethnic groups, to get a really good understanding about why they work in that sector and what their experience has been like. And the insight that we got was fantastic. We got some nuances across people that worked in the public sector versus the private sector versus the community sector, but overall, there was some really interesting things that came through that piece of research and insight. So if anyone's out there that wants to know a little bit more about how to engage better and how to recruit people from different backgrounds, please go, and it's called Breaking Barriers. And if you find me on LinkedIn, I'll be able to share the link with you. Really good piece of work that started with insight, understanding the problem, and then we had a number of recommendations to support people to increase the diversity within their comms and marketing teams. Now, a lot of the reflections is around the public sector and the NHS, but there are commonalities across all sectors. So I really do hope people do take a minute to actually read that report and use it to support your recruitment and retention of people from diverse backgrounds. And that's all types of diversities, not just ethnic diversities, also people from more deprived backgrounds, etc.
Thank you. Talking about resources, GottaBe ethnic page is also full of those. You can find an ethnic calendar, so if you don't know when the certain celebrations are happening, if you're looking to find out more about the Muslim community in the UK, there are various reports available for you to download for free on our website. There's plenty of insights, and the blogs are also fantastic. And it's not because I get to write them, but it's also because we love to share insights. So just as we're sort of coming to an end, I want to, at the start I mentioned, we want to make sure we empower you and we give you insights and tools. So one piece of advice we always like to finish with, sort of one thing forward, if we can take it. So Sam, I think you've already sort of alluded to sensors, but what's the one sort of underrated resource or tool that marketeers should be using to make their work more inclusive?
I mean, I've already plugged the census. I would happily plug it again, to be honest.
Anything else?
No. I would say, I mean, it sounds very basic, but I would say just if you're curious and have time, the government website, which is linked to the census, has a ton of amazing free research around people's attitudes and behaviours. Things you might not even think are that interesting or worthwhile often are the first piece in a much wider puzzle. Things like internet usage and how that differs by age or ethnicity, things like vaccine rates, which is probably a bit more salient, has a whole ton of stuff, which I say absolutely free, easy to access, and I'd really recommend everyone using that. If you want to change people's perceptions, you can't do that without understanding them first. So I think that for me is always the first port of call.
And Edna, coming to you, how do we sort of empower people internally? So how do we sort of get the senior comms and teams to sort of lead better, but also ultimately use the resources that's out there? What would it be for you, and what would be your recommendation?
So we've already discussed how important it is to engage with people from diverse backgrounds, and given how, in 50% in London it's from diverse backgrounds, etc. So if we want to make this all about the bottom line for organisations, in London you are missing 50% of the population if you are not being targeted, and if you're not hitting the mark with people from diverse backgrounds, particularly ethnically diverse. So I think that there is something about we need to manage up sometimes and actually teach the leadership about why it's so important that we need to be engaging or communicating with people from different backgrounds. And I would also say that piece around getting them to understand why, in order to engage with them, we need to have some diversity within our organisation and be representative of our workforce and of the communities we're trying to engage with. So I think there's that piece of us all kind of always banging the drum about the importance of diversity in all its forms.
Perfect, thank you so much. And with that being said, that's all we've got time for the panel, but please stick around, we've got more panels coming just in a moment. So once again, Edna Boampong, Director of Communications and Engagement at the Liverpool City Council, and Salama, Senior Insights Manager at the Met Police. Thank you so much.